Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take source material like the book you sent us and really try to pull out the core insights.
Yeah, make it accessible, spark some of those, aha moments.
Exactly. And today we are diving into Jurgen Moltmann's The Crucified God. It's a heavy hitter.
Oh, absolutely. A book that genuinely challenges a lot of traditional thinking.
Mm.
So our mission today, I guess, is to unpack Moltmann's whole idea about a God who suffers, especially as seen on the cross.
Right. Not just what he said, but why it's so important, maybe even surprising.
Precisely. How it gives us a different angle on faith, the world, all of it.
Okay, so let's get started. Moltmann's focus on the cross. This wasn't just like an academic thing for him, was it? It came from somewhere deeper.
Absolutely. Not just academic. It was profoundly personal. His time as a prisoner of war after World War II, that was crucial.
Right, I remember reading that.
Imagine being there, seeing that devastation. For him and others of his generation, any theology that didn't grapple with suffering, with that sense of abandonment you see in the crucified Christ, it just wouldn't have worked. It would have felt
Huh.
empty.
Yeah, meaningless.
Totally. And then during that time, he really encountered Reformation theology, which heavily emphasizes the cross. So that kind of solidified it for him. The key thing really is that this theology wasn't born in comfort. It was forged right there in the fire of, well, immense human suffering.
And it wasn't just that early experience, was it? You mentioned it kind of came back to him later.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting. He found himself drawn back to the cross during times of, let's say, social and political disappointment.
Like when things weren't going as hoped.
Exactly. Setbacks in places like Czechoslovakia, struggles in the U.S. civil rights movement, even when ecumenical progress stalled. It suggests the cross wasn't just about a historical event for him.
It was ongoing.
Right. A continuous source of hope, maybe even a basis for resistance when things look bleak. It really shows the power of that image to speak across different kinds of struggles.
So from personal trauma to these bigger historical moments,
Hmm.
the cross is this incredibly loaded symbol. Now, Moltmann really hammers home how scandalous the cross was originally, doesn't he? It wasn't this respected symbol we sometimes see it as now.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost impossible for us now to really feel just the sheer disgust the cross inspired in Roman society.
Disgust. That's strong.
Yeah, think about Cicero, a major Roman figure. He literally wanted the name of the cross kept away from Roman citizens. It was the absolute bottom rung, the most degrading death imaginable, save for slaves and the worst criminals.
Wow.
So this idea of a religion of the cross, I mean, to the Romans, it was just ugly, disrespectful, kind of perverse, frankly.
So the core idea is this radical flip of values. Christianity starts with the most shameful thing possible.
Exactly. It forces this complete rethink of power, of what divinity even means.
It wasn't just the Romans, though, right? It clashed with Jewish tradition, too.
Right. The whole concept of a crucified God flew in the face of, well, pretty much everyone's understanding of God back then. In Jewish tradition, you had Deuteronomy chapter 21, which talks about anyone hung on a tree being cursed by God. That's a huge hurdle.
Okay. Yeah.
And for the Romans, like we said, their gods just didn't do weakness and humiliation like that. It just didn't compute. And this fundamental clash is why the early Christians faced so much hostility.
And that wasn't just theoretical disagreement. People got hurt.
Definitely. They were accused of irreligiositas, basically, impiety and sacrilegium,
Yeah.
just because they didn't join in the state cult, the emperor worship.
Because their God was a crucified criminal.
Precisely. They were even called atheists because they didn't worship the Roman gods. And this wasn't just name-calling. It had real legal consequences. Social exclusion, persecution, even death.
So the cross wasn't a victory banner initially. It was a symbol of shame, of opposition.
Exactly what Moltmann stresses. It was a sign of contradiction and scandal, not triumph in any normal sense. You know that piece of ancient graffiti, the Alexamenos graffito?
Vaguely, yeah. The one with the donkey head.
That's the one. A crude drawing mocking someone worshiping a crucified figure with a donkey's head. It just shows the level of contempt they faced.
Okay, so that sets up this next really provocative idea Moltmann tackles the death of God within Christian theology. That phrase sounds jarring.
It does, and it's crucial to get what Moltmann means here. He's not like the originator of some nihilistic God is dead idea in the way Nietzsche meant it.
Right, he's doing something different with it.
He's engaging with that concept in relation to Christian thought. You had
Yeah.
thinkers like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, writing from a Nazi prison, saying profound things like, only the suffering God can help.
Wow.
And Kazuo Kitamori in Japan, writing his Theology of the Pain of God, These voices were already pushing back against that traditional idea of a God who is totally unaffected, impassible.
A distant God.
Exactly. Moltmann sort of takes this further. He's saying God isn't absent in suffering, he's profoundly present. And this challenges both the people who expect a God who only shows power and glory, and those who use suffering as a reason to dismiss God altogether.
So the crucified God kind of messes with both traditional belief and atheism.
You could put it that way, yeah. He argues it goes beyond that simple theism-atheism split. It presents a God who enters into the absolute depths of human pain, of abandonment, in a way that challenges both ideas, the detached, perfect God and the simple rejection of God because suffering exists.
This definitely leads into the tricky stuff about God's suffering and the Trinity, because that pushes hard against some old theological ideas, doesn't it? That God can't suffer.
Oh, absolutely. That traditional idea of God's apatheia, it comes heavily from Greek philosophy. The idea that God, to be perfect, has to be unchanging and therefore can't be affected by emotions or suffer. And that idea became really influential in early Christian thought. But it created this huge tension. If God can't suffer, how does that square with Jesus Christ, who clearly did suffer and die?
Yeah, how does an unsuffering God really connect with or redeem human suffering? It seems like a disconnect.
Exactly. It almost splits Jesus the human from God the divine. The early church wrestled with this.
How do they try to fix it?
Well, there were formulations like the Theopashite formula, the idea that one of the Holy Trinity suffered in the flesh.
So specifying who suffered.
Right, trying to locate the suffering within the Trinity, specifically in the Son's human nature. But even that didn't fully break the hold of apatheia, that core idea that the divine nature itself couldn't suffer.
So Moltmann goes further.
He really does. He argues for a thoroughly Trinitarian theology of the cross. For him, the crucifixion isn't just something that happens to Jesus, it's an event that reveals the inner life of the Trinity itself. He talks about the Son's cry of abandonment from the Father, and the Father's own grief and suffering in that abandonment and giving up the Son. He calls it a God event in Trinitarian terms.
So the cross reveals God's own relationships, God's own pain.
In a sense, yes. It shows a God who is deeply relational, whose very being is affected by love and loss. It's not just about Jesus anymore. It's revealing the heart of the triune God.
That connects to what you said about God not being distant.
Exactly. Moltmann leans on Martin Luther here, too. Luther had this really strong sense of the unity between Christ and God. He could boldly say that when the man Jesus died, you could rightly speak of the death of God because they were so united in one person.
But that sounds paradoxical, too.
It is, and Moltmann points that out. You have to be careful just throwing around the word God here. Are we talking about the whole divine nature or the specific person of the Son who became human and suffered? Using God without that distinction leads to some tricky paradoxes.
Okay, moving on slightly. Moltmann also frames the cross as a kind of criticism, not just history, but something that actively challenges us now. What's he getting at there?
He's saying the cross forces us back to the absolute basics of Christian faith. It strips away all the cultural stuff, the comfortable assumptions we layer on top.
Like making Christianity fit neatly into our lives.
Yeah, exactly. He talks about its homelessness not just in the secular world, but even within what he calls syncretistic bourgeois Christianity, where faith gets watered down, blended too easily with middle-class values or national identity.
So theology shouldn't just describe religion, it should be disruptive.
That's the idea. It should commit itself to the reality of the cross, which is inherently challenging.
And he uses this phrase, the irreligious thing in Christian faith. What does that mean?
It sounds provocative, right? But he means the cross, the reality of a suffering, abandoned God in Christ, is fundamentally different from what humans typically create as religion.
How?
Human religion often involves projections of our own desires for power, for comfort, for control. The cross cuts against all that. It's not about human achievement or feeling good. Moltmann says it acts like a crucifixion of all religion in that sense.
All religion, including Christian religion.
Including the ways Christianity can become just another human system, worshiping our own ideas, making certain places or times sacred in themselves, or crucially, blessing political power. Even Jesus' own followers ran away at the cross, remember?
Right, so the core isn't human effort, but God's action in suffering.
Exactly. God's radical solidarity. And this really ties into Luther's theology crucis, the theology of the cross.
As opposed to the theology of glory.
Right. For Luther, the theology crucis wasn't just an option. It was the way to know God truly. God isn't found primarily in power and glory, the things humans admire. God is revealed most profoundly in the cross, in weakness, in suffering, right in the midst of the world's brokenness,
So the theologian of glory looks for God up high.
and tries to become like God through reason or power. But the theologian of the cross, Luther says, finds God down low in humility in the suffering Christ. And that, Luther argued, is where true humanity is actually restored, not by trying to be divine, but by recognizing God in the depths.
Okay, so Moltmann takes this theology of the cross and says it has to impact how we live, right? This following the crucified Christ. It's ethical.
Absolutely, it's not just head knowledge. He points to the Apostle Paul. Like in Galatians chapter 5,
Mhm.
Paul translates the word of the cross into an ethics of the cross,
Hmm.
meaning believers are called to crucify their flesh, that's Paul's phrase, to die to those self-centered drives, and instead make the self-giving love of Jesus visible in how they actually live.
Being crucified with Christ, like in baptism.
Exactly. That symbolism in baptism signifies this radical break, turning away from a life shaped by the world's power games and values and towards Christ's way of love.
Mm.
The core idea is that faith isn't passive, it's active participation in that self-giving love.
That sounds incredibly demanding. A whole different way of being.
It is. Look at Paul's own life, filled with hardship, opposition, rejection. Moltmann would say those weren't sufferings, Paul chose exactly, but they were the natural result of following the crucified one.
But it's not just about trying harder to be good, is it?
No, and Moltmann warns against reducing it to just ethics. He emphasizes orthopraxy, the unity of right belief and right practice. They have to go together.
And you mentioned this has political implications too, not just personal piety.
Definitely. For Moltmann, being crucified with Christ challenges how we engage with power structures, with injustice. It has to spill out into the public square. It leads to a political theology rooted in the cross.
But Christ's cross was unique.
Yes, he's clear on that. While our suffering and love can echo Christ, his cross, especially that feeling of utter abandonment by the Father, is unique and unrepeatable. It goes beyond the suffering that's just part of loving others.
Okay, last big piece, the eschatological significance. How does the cross relate to the future, to the end times?
Moltmann argues you can only really understand the resurrection if you see it through the lens of the crucifixion. And both point forward to God's ultimate future, God's final glory.
So the crucifixion isn't just past history.
No, it's the eschatological event of judgment. It reveals the truth about sin and God's radical response to it. The cross becomes the pattern, the shape of the coming kingdom of redemption. The crucified Jesus is the form the risen Christ takes in the world.
So God wasn't just watching from afar during the crucifixion.
Absolutely not. That's key for Moltmann. God was profoundly active in Jesus' suffering on the cross. God was suffering with him, taking on sin, taking on rejection.
Which means the cross actually reveals something that happened within God.
Yes, he talks about a change, a stasis within the Godhead. It's complex, but it ultimately leads to that fundamental Christian declaration. God is love. The cross is the ultimate costly proof of that love. It shows a God who isn't static and untouched, but deeply, intimately involved in the world's pain and its healing.
So wrapping this all up, what's the takeaway for us today? How is this crucified God relevant now?
Well, I mean, it's a constant challenge, isn't it, to our modern obsessions with success, power, control, even our easy ideas about God.
How so?
This theology of the cross gives us a really sharp, critical tool to look at our society. Political religions, nationalism, consumerism, all the idols we create.
And personally.
And it speaks directly to human suffering, to injustice.
Yeah.
It suggests that when we suffer out of love or for the sake of justice, God isn't distant. God is right there with us, suffering alongside us.
It's a powerful idea.
It is. And it offers this deep well of strength, the power to keep loving, keep striving, because we see God's own love poured out on the cross. Moltmann connects this to political hermeneutics, reading the cross in a way that pushes us to act for liberation, for justice in concrete situations.
Wow. Okay. This deep dive into Moltmann's The Crucified God, it really does uncover this incredibly radical, complex view of a symbol we thought we knew. Definitely full of those surprising insights and aha moments.
Absolutely. It forces you to rethink so much about God, about suffering, about what it means to follow Christ in the world today.
So for you, our listener, as you process all this, maybe chew on this question. How does this idea, this profound concept of a God who suffers, actually reshape your understanding of divine power and how you view the reality of human suffering all around us?
Yeah, that's a good question to sit with. And honestly, we've only scratched the surface here. Moltmann's book is dense, but incredibly rewarding if you want to explore these ideas further.
Definitely worth the read. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.